The $100 bill fluttered onto the dark mahogany table like a dying bird. It landed right in front of me, crisp and mocking, a splash of green against the deep, polished wood that probably cost more than the apartment I'd been living in for the last 3 years. I didn't reach for it. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the Benjamin Franklin on the bill, feeling the weight of every eye in that room pressing against my skin. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips, the kind of smirk that belonged on a man who believed he owned the world and everyone in it. "Go on, Dad," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with a fake, sugary kindness that made my stomach churn. "Take it. Get yourself some decent coffee on the way home. Maybe buy a suit that doesn't smell like a basement. It's the least I can do, considering." Everyone in the room laughed. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh. It was worse. It was that soft, cultured tittering of people who think they're better than you. Sarah, Daniel's wife, didn't even try to hide her amusement. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, which she insisted on wearing indoors, and whispered something into Daniel's ear that made him chuckle even harder. Her mother, Catherine, sat beside her, clutching a gold cross at her throat and looking at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if I were a stain on the carpet that the cleaning crew had missed. I sat there, by muy bon years old, feeling every single day of it. My shoulders felt heavy in the navy blue suit I'd borrowed from my brother-in-law, Robert. It was 2 sizes too big, the fabric scratchy and smelling faintly of the mothballs Linda had used to preserve it in her attic. I had lost so much weight since the incident, that's what I called it in my head, that I looked like a ghost haunting my own clothes. My hands were folded in my lap, trembling just enough that I had to grip my knees to keep them still. I looked at my son, my only son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the toddler I'd stayed up with through every fever, the man I had spent every penny I owned to put through the best schools. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing. There was no recognition of the man who had raised him. There was only the cold, hard calculation of a man waiting for his inheritance. He was so sure he'd won. He was so sure that today was the day he finally became the king of the mountain Emily had built. I didn't know it yet, but the manila envelope sitting in front of the lawyer held a truth that was about to strip the skin off Daniel's arrogance. "If we're quite finished with the charity work," Attorney Arthur Stone said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a cold wind. He was a man of impeccable stature, with a white mustache and a suit that probably cost a year of my Social Security checks. He didn't look at Daniel with the same admiration everyone else did. He looked at him like a scientist might look at a particularly unpleasant mold culture. "We have a great deal to get through. Mrs. Emily Stone's estate is extensive." The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens right before a storm breaks. To understand how I ended up in that chair, being mocked by my own flesh and blood, you have to understand the walk I took that morning. I had stepped out of a taxi in front of the Blackwood Plaza, a tower of glass and steel that seemed to reach up and pierce the very sky. The sun reflected off the windows, blinding me for a second. I stood there on the sidewalk, clutching a worn leather briefcase that contained nothing but a few old photos and a folded-up handkerchief. The doorman had looked me up and down, his nose wrinkling at the scent of my mothball-laden suit. He didn't open the door for me. He just waited until I pushed it myself, my joints aching with the effort. I felt like an intruder in a temple of wealth. People in tailored dresses and $1,000 shoes buzzed past me, their eyes sliding right over me as if I were invisible. "David, look at me." My sister Linda had told me that morning, grabbing my face with her rough, flour-dusted hands. She had been the only one there for me when the world collapsed. "That boy is not going to humiliate you today. You hear me? You are a Valverde. You carry your head high because you are the only one in that room with a clean soul." I had nodded, but we both knew it was a lie. I was a broken man, and Daniel knew exactly where the cracks were. Inside the office, the air conditioning was set so low, it felt like a morgue. The view from the Bonmoy Lempth floor showed the entire city laid out like a toy set, but all I could focus on was the empty chair at the head of the table. The chair where Emily should have been. My Emily. We had been divorced for 20 years, but seeing her name on those legal documents still felt like a physical blow to the chest. We had built a life together once, before the money, before the lawyers, and before she'd been swept away by the high society world that eventually swallowed our son whole. "Mr. David," Attorney Stone said, gesturing to the chair at the far end of the table, "please, take a seat." It was the guest chair. The chair for the person who was legally required to be there but wasn't expected to stay. I walked toward it, my cheap shoes squeaking on the marble floor. I felt Sarah's eyes on me. She lowered her glasses to the tip of her nose, her eyes scanning my oversized suit with a predatory gleam. "Oh, David," she cooed, her voice like silk over a blade. "I was worried you wouldn't make it. Did the bus run late, or did you have to walk? We would have sent a car, but Daniel said you preferred simplicity." Daniel didn't even look up from his phone. He was busy scrolling, probably checking the stock market or looking at sports cars he planned to buy with his mother's millions. "Let him be, Sarah," he muttered. "He's here now. Let's just get the numbers over with." Catherine, the mother-in-law, sighed loudly, fanning herself with a manicured hand. "It's just so tawdry, isn't it? A family matter like this being handled with, well, with everyone present. It feels so exposed." She meant me. I was the exposure. I was the reminder of a past they wanted to bury under layers of silk and mahogany. Pamela, Emily's stepdaughter from her second marriage, was the only one who didn't look at me like I was a beggar. She sat across from me, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She had loved Emily, truly loved her. She reached out and gave me a small, sad nod. I tried to return it, but my face felt like it was made of stone. "Very well," Attorney Stone said, clearing his throat. He broke the red wax seal on a large, heavy envelope. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "I, Emily Christina Stone, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." He began to list the assets. It was a litany of wealth that made my head spin. 3 villas in Europe, a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, a penthouse in Manhattan, controlling interests in 3 different tech firms, stocks, bonds, offshore accounts. "The total valuation of the liquid and fixed assets," Stone said, pausing for dramatic effect, "is $178 million. I heard Daniel catch his breath. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her rings glinting in the office lights. Catherine actually let out a small, muffled, "Oh my." They were already spending it. I could see it in the way Daniel's posture changed. He sat up straighter, his chest puffing out, the king finally receiving his crown. But I was watching Attorney Stone, and Stone wasn't looking at Daniel. He was looking at me. "However," Stone continued, his voice dropping an octave, "Mrs. Stone was very specific about the distribution. She left a series of prerequisites, conditions that must be met before a single cent is transferred to the primary beneficiary." Daniel's smile faltered. "Conditions? What are you talking about? I'm her only son. The law is pretty clear on this, Arthur." "The law is clear on the validity of a signed and notarized will, Daniel," Stone replied coldly. "And your mother spent the last 6 months of her life ensuring this document was airtight. She knew you'd fight it. She counted on it." Sarah leaned forward, her voice sharp. "What kind of conditions?" Emily was sick. She was on a lot of medication toward the end. If she was being manipulated into adding crazy clauses, "I can assure you, Mrs. Valverde," Stone interrupted, "that Emily was never more lucid than the day she wrote this. In fact, she recorded a video statement to accompany each section of the will, just in case anyone questioned her state of mind." My heart began to thud against my ribs. Emily. What had she done? "Before we proceed to the first disbursement," Stone said, reaching into the envelope and pulling out a smaller blue envelope, "there is a message, specifically for Daniel." Daniel scoffed, though I could see the sweat beginning to bead on his upper lip. "Fine. Let's hear it. She probably wants me to donate a wing to some library or something. I can handle a bit of philanthropy." Stone opened the blue envelope and began to read. "To my son, Daniel, you have always been a man of great ambition. You have always known the value of $1, but you have forgotten the value of a man. You think you are here today to collect a prize. You are not. You are here to face a reckoning." The silence in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Daniel's face went from pale to a deep, mottled red. "What is this? This isn't a will, it's a lecture." Stone ignored him and turned a page. Section 1. The kitchen floor. I felt the air leave my lungs. My vision blurred. The kitchen floor. "Wait," Daniel stammered, his voice suddenly high and thin. That has nothing to do with her money. She wasn't even there. She didn't know." "She knew everything, Daniel," Stone said, his eyes hard as flint. "She knew about the day you visited your father 3 months ago. She knew about the argument, and she knew exactly what you did when he fell." I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I wasn't in a high-rise office anymore. I was back on the cold linoleum of my tiny kitchen. I could feel the crushing weight in my chest, the way the world had tilted on its axis as my heart failed me. I remembered looking up at my son, gasping for air, reaching for his pant leg, begging him to call Chinchumwimot. And I remembered Daniel. I remembered him looking down at me with those same cold eyes. I remembered him stepping over my trembling hand. I remembered the sound of the door closing and the lock clicking into place, leaving me to die in the dark. "What happened next," Stone said, his voice echoing in the silent office, "is the reason this inheritance is about to become your greatest nightmare." He reached for a remote on the table and pressed a button. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. It wasn't Emily's face that appeared. It was a security camera feed. A grainy, black and white angle of a hallway. Daniel's breath hitched. "Where did you get that?" "Your father's apartment building has excellent security, Daniel," Stone said. "But your mother, she had something better. She had a private investigator who had been following you for months." On the screen, the date Hum, Bamui Hai flashed in the corner. I watched as Daniel walked out of my apartment, adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, and pulled out his phone. He wasn't calling an ambulance. He was smiling. The lawyer turned back to the second page of the will, and the look he gave Daniel was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Because Emily knew," Stone whispered. "She knew you left him there to die. And she decided that if you wanted to act like a man who had no father, you would start by having no mother's fortune to hide behind." Daniel stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is a setup. This is a fake. I'm going to sue you, Stone. I'm going to sue everyone." "Sit down, Daniel," Stone said, his voice like iron. "Because we haven't even gotten to the part about the second will, the one she signed the day before she passed." Stone looked at me, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. "Mr. David, I believe you should hear this next part very carefully." I gripped my knees, my heart racing. I looked at the Pate Mochum bill still sitting on the table. It looked so small now, so insignificant. "The first line of the second page reads as follows," Stone said, his voice booming, "to the man who stood by me when I had nothing, and to the man who survived the cruelty of his own blood." Daniel's face went white as a sheet. He looked like he was about to faint. "What does it say?" Sarah shrieked, her voice cracking. "Read the rest." Stone looked at Daniel, then at the screen, then back to the document. He took a deep breath. "It says that Daniel Valverde is hereby disinherited from the liquid assets of this estate, effective immediately, pending a criminal investigation into the events of April Moorbath." The room exploded. Sarah was screaming. Catherine was clutching her cross so hard her knuckles were white. But Daniel just stared at me. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at a nothing. He was looking at the man who held his entire future in his hands. But Stone wasn't done. He turned the page, his expression darkening. "And as for the Mochumbai Muitam million, there is one more person mentioned in this will, someone Daniel thought he had erased from history." The door to the office opened. I turned my head, expecting a clerk or a secretary. Instead, a woman walked in. She was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and a familiar set to her jaw. She looked exactly like Emily did 40 years ago. Daniel gasped, his voice a broken whisper. "No, you're dead. You're supposed to be dead." The woman walked straight to the table, ignored Daniel entirely, and stood beside my chair. She put a hand on my shoulder, and for the first time in a decade, I felt a spark of hope. "Hello, Dad," she said. I didn't know I had a daughter. And judging by the look on Daniel's face, he was realizing that the Mochum bill on the table wasn't just an insult, it was the only money he was ever going to see again. The room felt like it was losing oxygen. Daniel's face was no longer red with rage. It was a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at the woman standing beside me, Elena, as if she were a ghost that had crawled out of the floorboards. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "No, that's impossible," Mom said. "She said the baby didn't make it. She said the fire took everything." Elena's grip on my shoulder tightened. Her hand was warm, steady, and for a man who had spent the last decade feeling like a discarded piece of trash, that simple human touch felt like a lifeline. She didn't look at Daniel with anger. She looked at him with a chilling, clinical detachment. "She lied, Daniel," Elena said softly. "She lied to protect me from the person she was afraid you were becoming. And looking at you now, I see she was right." I looked up at her. My vision swimming. I had a daughter. All those years, all those nights, sitting in my cramped apartment, staring at old Polaroids of Daniel as a toddler, wondering where I had gone wrong, and there had been another. I remembered the fire. 25 years ago. A summer cabin in the mountains. Emily and I had been separated for 5 years by then. I'd heard there was an accident, a fire that claimed a family member. I thought it was her aunt. I never knew Emily had been pregnant when she left. I never knew there was a sister. Arthur, Sarah snapped, her voice breaking the spell. She was standing now, her expensive sunglasses discarded on the table, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal's. This is a circus. This woman is an actress. A fraud. You can't just let some stranger walk in and claim a stake in $100 million estate. Attorney Stone didn't even look up from his papers. Mrs. Valverde, I suggest you sit down before you find yourself escorted out by the security detail waiting in the hall. Elena's identity has been verified through 3 separate DNA panels, all court-ordered and supervised by this firm over the last 6 months. She is the biological daughter of Emily Stone and David Valverde. The words hit me like a physical blow. My daughter. I looked at her again, searching for myself in her features. She had my nose, perhaps, but she had Emily's eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes that could see through a person's soul. Why? I managed to croak out. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Why didn't she tell me? Elena looked down at me, and for a fleeting second, the clinical mask slipped, revealing a deep, aching sadness. She wanted to, Dad. Every year, on your birthday, she'd write a letter. I have a box of them. But she was trapped. Herbert Lara, her second husband, he was a powerful man. He made her choose. If she wanted to keep me, if she wanted me to have a life of safety, she had to erase the Valverde name. She had to pretend I was his. And when he died, she was too deep in the lie to get out. Daniel let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. Oh, this is rich. So the little princess was hidden away in boarding schools in Switzerland while I had to deal with the old man's pathetic phone calls. While I had to listen to him beg for time and connection. He spat the words, looking at me with renewed venom. You think this changes anything? She's a ghost. She doesn't have a claim to the primary trust. The bloodline rules are clear. You're right about one thing, Daniel, Stone said, turning a page slowly. The bloodline rules are clear, and that is exactly why you should be very, very worried about what comes next. To understand the poison in Daniel's heart, you have to understand the years that led us to this mahogany table. We weren't always like this. There was a time, 30 years ago, when we were a family. I was a foreman at a construction site, and Emily worked as a legal secretary. We lived in a house that smelled like pine cleaner and home-cooked meals. Daniel was a bright kid, always wanting to help me in the garage, always asking how things were built. But then the shift happened. Emily wanted more. She didn't just want a life, she wanted a legacy. When she met Herbert Lara at a charity gala she'd scraped together enough money to attend, she saw a door opening, and she walked through it. She divorced me, moved Daniel into a mansion, and suddenly, my son was being driven to school in a limousine. I tried to keep up. I worked 3 jobs to pay for the extras. He wanted the designer sneakers, the high-end electronics, just so I could see him for a weekend every month. But the more I gave, the less he respected the effort. He started looking at my calloused hands with embarrassment. He started lying to his friends, telling them his father was a consultant who was traveling abroad, rather than a man who spent his days in the dirt and his nights at a diner. The real turning point was Sarah. She came into his life 5 years ago, a woman who smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. She saw Daniel as a golden ticket. She whispered in his ear that I was a drain on his potential, a relic of a past he needed to outgrow. She encouraged the distance. She turned his embarrassment into a weapon. I didn't know it then, I said, my voice gaining a bit of strength as I looked at my son. But the day you married Sarah was the day I lost you for good. I remember the wedding. I wasn't invited, of course. I sat on my porch with a 6-pack of beer and watched the photos on social media. You looked so happy, Daniel. But you looked like a stranger. Don't give me that poor me routine, Dad, Daniel snapped, pacing the length of the office. You chose to live in that dump. You chose to stay small. You were a reminder of everything I didn't want to be, and Mom knew it. She gave me everything because she knew I was the one who could handle the weight of this family's name. Did she? Elena interjected, her voice cold. Because the way I remember it, Mom spent the last 3 years of her life in a state of constant mourning. Not for her health, but for the son she'd created. She watched you become a monster, Daniel. She watched you and Sarah bleed the Lara accounts dry for your investments that always seemed to disappear. And then, she saw what happened on the kitchen floor. The incident. The day my world ended. It had been a Tuesday. I had called Daniel because the chest pains were getting worse. I didn't want money. I just wanted someone to talk to. Someone to tell me it was going to be okay. He'd actually shown up, which was rare. I thought, for a moment, that we were going to have a real conversation. "I can't do this, Dad," he'd said, standing in my tiny kitchen, looking at the peeling wallpaper with disgust. "Sarah and I have a gala tonight. I don't have time for you to complain about your heartburn again. If you're that sick, go to the clinic." "Daniel, please," I'd whispered, reaching out for his arm. "Something's wrong. It's not heartburn." I felt the pressure then, like an elephant was sitting on my chest. I fell. My knees hit the linoleum, and the world started to go gray at the edges. I looked up at him, gasping, my hand clawing at his pant leg. I couldn't speak, but my eyes were screaming, "Help me, please, don't leave me." He didn't move. He didn't reach for his phone. He just looked at me with a bored, irritated expression. "Always so dramatic," he muttered. He shook my hand off his leg as if I were a stray dog. "I'll call you tomorrow when you've calmed down." He walked out. I heard his leather shoes clicking on the hallway floor. I heard the front door close. I heard the lock click. I lay there for 4 hours, staring at the dust bunnies under the stove, waiting for the dark to take me. If it hadn't been for Henry, my neighbor, coming over to borrow a cup of sugar, I'd be in a pine box right now. "I watched the footage, Daniel," Attorney Stone said, interrupting my thoughts. "The investigator Mrs. Stone hired. He didn't just have a camera in the hallway. He had one inside the apartment. Your mother wanted to see if you were visiting your father. She wanted to see if there was any love left in you." Stone leaned forward, his eyes boring into Daniel's. "She saw you watch him collapse. She saw you look at the phone on the counter and decide not to pick it up. She saw you step over him. And she saw the smile on your face as you left." Sarah gasped, her face pale. "Daniel, you said he was just sleeping. You said he was fine." Daniel didn't look at her. He was staring at the screen on the wall, which was now showing a still image of him standing over my prone body. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with panic. I thought he was faking it. He was always trying to get my attention. How was I supposed to know? "You didn't care to know," Elena said. "And that's why Mom made the change. That's why she brought me back into the light. She realized that the only way to save the Valverde name was to cut out the rot." Stone picked up a thick, leather-bound folder. "This brings us to Section 2 of the will, the verification of kinship and the transfer of control. Since Daniel Valverde has been found to have violated the duty of care clause, a legal stipulation, Mrs. Stone added specifically to address familial neglect. The primary trust is no longer his to inherit." "What?" Daniel screamed, lunging toward the table. "You can't do that. That's not a thing. Duty of care? That's for doctors and nurses." "In this will, it's a requirement for the beneficiary," Stone replied calmly. "And since you failed, the control of the Mochumbe Muita million, the properties, and the firms, passes to the secondary beneficiary." He looked at Elena. She took a step forward, her chin held high. "But," Stone added, "there is a catch. A secret folder Emily left for David, something that involves a debt that was never paid, and a truth about the fire 25 years ago that no one, not even Elena, knows." Stone reached into the bottom of the envelope and pulled out a small, blackened piece of wood tied with a silver ribbon. He laid it on the table. "David," Stone said, his voice soft, "your wife didn't just hide a daughter. She was hiding a crime, and the person who committed it is sitting in this room." I looked at the blackened wood, then at Daniel, whose eyes were suddenly darting toward the door. My heart began to hammer. The fire hadn't been an accident, and I was starting to realize that the betrayal I'd suffered on the kitchen floor was only the tip of the iceberg. The silence that followed Attorney Stone's words was heavy, like a shroud falling over a casket. I stared at that blackened shard of wood, charred, brittle, and smelling faintly of a past I had tried to bury in the deep recesses of my mind. It looked like a piece of a skeleton. My heart began to thud in a slow, painful rhythm, a dull ache radiating from the scar on my chest, where the surgeons had opened me up. 25 years. For 25 years, I had carried the weight of that fire as my greatest failure. I thought I had lost everything that night. I didn't know the embers were still burning. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the wood, his pupils shrinking to pinpricks. His hands, usually so steady and manicured, were white-knuckled as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. He looked like he wanted to reach out and crush the shard into dust, to make it disappear as if it had never existed. But Elena was watching him, her gaze a cold blue flame. She didn't flinch. She didn't even breathe. She just waited for the ghost to speak. "The fire at the Blackwood cabin," I whispered, my voice cracking. "The investigators said it was a faulty heater. They said the structure was old. The wiring was dry rot. They said it was an act of God." I looked at Stone, my eyes pleading for a different truth. Emily almost died. She was in the hospital for months. And the baby. We were told the smoke took the baby. "That's what the police report said, David," Stone replied, his voice soft but carrying a jagged edge. But Emily didn't trust the police report. She knew the heater hadn't been turned on that night. It was a midsummer evening in the mountains. Why would anyone turn on the heat? He reached into the leather-bound folder and pulled out a yellowed transcript, a private confession, signed by a man I didn't recognize. "This is from the caretaker of the property. He was paid $50,000 by Herbert Lara to keep his mouth shut. But before he died last year, he sent this to Emily. He couldn't go to his grave with the weight of it." "This is ridiculous!" Sarah shrieked, her voice hitting a high, frantic note that set my teeth on edge. She moved toward Daniel, grabbing his arm as if she could pull him out of the room, away from the truth. Daniel was a child. He was 15 years old. "You're accusing a 15-year-old of arson? This is a character assassination. Arthur, I swear to God, we will strip you of your license for this." "Sit down, Sarah," Daniel muttered. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its previous bravado. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at me. He was staring into a memory I hadn't been invited to. "I wasn't a child," Daniel said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "I was a man. I saw what was happening. I saw how you looked at her, Dad. I saw how you looked at that thing she was carrying." He finally looked at me, and the hate in his eyes was so pure it felt like a physical burn. "You didn't care about me anymore. Once you knew there was a new one coming, a perfect one with Emily, I became the leftovers. The foreman's kid who wasn't smart enough, wasn't polished enough. I heard you talking in the garage. You said she was your second chance. What was I, Dad? Your first mistake?" I felt a coldness settle in my marrow. "Daniel, no, that's not true. You were my world. I worked those double shifts so you wouldn't have to feel the dirt under your fingernails like I did. I did everything for you. You did everything to get away from me," he roared, slamming his palms onto the table. The water glasses rattled. "You and Mom were always whispering about the future. And the future didn't include the kid who struggled with math and got into fights. It included the new baby, the one who was going to be the real Valverde." He turned his gaze back to the blackened wood. "So I took care of the future. I made sure there was only one hair. I made sure I was the only thing you had left to love." The room went deathly silent. Sarah froze. Even Catherine looked horrified, her hand trembling as she touched the gold cross at her neck. Daniel had just confessed to a 25-year-old crime in a room full of lawyers and witnesses. He didn't seem to care. He looked relieved, as if the secret had been a poison he'd finally vomited out. Elena took a step toward him. She was smaller than him, but in that moment, she looked like a giant. "You didn't take care of the future, Daniel," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "You just forced Mom into the hardest choice of her life. She found the matches in your jacket that night. She saw you standing by the tree line, watching the roof collapse while she was screaming inside. She knew exactly what you were, and that's when she realized she couldn't keep me. Not if she wanted me to live." I looked at Elena, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into a horrifying picture. Emily hadn't just divorced me to marry Herbert Lara. She hadn't just left because she wanted the money and the mansions. She had left to save our daughter from our son. She had gone to Herbert, a man with the power and the cruelty to keep a secret that dark, and she had made a deal. She would be his trophy wife. She would give him the prestige of her beauty, and in exchange, he would help her fake the baby's death and hide her away. "She kept me in a convent in France for 10 years, Elena continued, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "Then a boarding school in London. I grew up thinking my father was dead, and my brother was a tragic hero who had tried to save us from a fire. I grew up believing a lie because the truth was too dangerous. But Mom kept a diary. She kept every letter you ever wrote to her, Dad. Every time you begged to see me. Every time you asked why she'd turned so cold. She saved them all for me. I wrote to her every week, I whispered. The memories of those lonely nights in my apartment flooding back. I thought she was ignoring me because she'd found a better life. I thought I wasn't good enough for her anymore. She was protecting you too, Dad, Elena said, her voice softening for the first time. She knew that if you found out the truth, you'd go to the police, and if you went to the police, Daniel would go to prison. And as much as she feared him, she still loved him. She was a mother. She spent 25 years trying to fix him, trying to buy his love with Lara's money, hoping that if he had everything, he wouldn't need to be a monster. She looked at Daniel with pure pity, but the money just made the monster bigger, didn't it? Daniel lunged across the table then. It happened so fast the security guard at the door didn't have time to react. He reached for Elena's throat, his face contorted into a mask of pure, primal rage. "I'll kill you," he screamed. "I'll finish what I started." I didn't think. I didn't feel the pain in my chest or the weakness in my legs. I threw myself between them. I felt Daniel's hands slam into my chest, right over my heart. The force of it sent me reeling back against my chair, the world spinning in a blur of mahogany and gray suits. "Get him off her!" Stone yelled. The guard tackled Daniel, pinning him to the floor. Sarah was hysterical now, screaming for them to stop, clawing at the guard's back. Catherine had fainted in her chair, her head lolling back. It was chaos. Pure, unadulterated chaos in the temple of the elite. I slumped in my chair, gasping for air. Elena was by my side in an instant, her hands on my face. "Dad, Dad, look at me. Breathe, just breathe." I looked at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights blurring into white halos. I felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was out. The rot had been exposed. I looked over at Daniel, who was being held down on the carpet, his face pressed into the fibers. He was sobbing now, not out of remorse, but out of the sheer, pathetic realization that his world had finally collapsed. Is he going to jail?" I managed to ask, my voice a thready whisper. Stone stood over Daniel, looking down at him with a cold, professional curiosity. The statute of limitations on the fire might be tricky, but the attempted murder of his father, the video of him leaving you to die, the conspiracy to defraud the estate. Yes, David, he's going away for a long, long time. Stone reached back onto the table and picked up the last folder, the one he'd called the secret folder. He looked at me, then at Elena. "There is one final piece to Emily's plan, a piece that ensures Daniel can never, ever hurt either of you again, even from behind bars." He opened the folder and took out a single, crimson-colored key. It looked old, ornate, out of place in this modern office. "What happened next," Stone said, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room, "is the reason Emily lived in terror for the last year of her life. She wasn't just hiding a daughter. She was hiding a fortune that Daniel has been searching for his entire adult life. A fortune that isn't part of the Motrumbai Muitam million." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What fortune?" Stone looked at the key, then at me. "Emily didn't just marry Herbert Lara for protection, David. She married him because she knew where he'd hidden the Blackwood ledger, the names of every politician, every judge, and every businessman he'd bought over 40 years. And she knew that Daniel was working with the very people listed in that book to take over the firm." Daniel stopped struggling. He looked up from the floor, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She told you about the ledger. She did more than tell me, Daniel," Stone said, a grim smile touching his lips. "She gave it to the one person she knew would never use it for power, the one person who would only use it for justice." Stone handed the crimson key to me. My hand trembled as I took it. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead. "What do I do with this?" I asked. "You go to the Blackwood cabin, David," Stone said. "Under the floorboards where the fire started there is a safe, and inside that safe is the proof that will either burn this city down or set you and Elena free forever." But as I gripped the key, I saw Sarah's eyes. She wasn't crying anymore. She was looking at me and the key with a cold, murderous intent that told me this wasn't over. I didn't know it yet, but the walk out of this building was going to be the most dangerous journey of my life. I didn't know it then, I thought, looking at the door, but someone was already waiting for me in the lobby, and they weren't there to offer me a ride. The sound of Daniel's muffled sobs echoed through the hallway, as the police who had been waiting just outside the door led him away in handcuffs. It was a surreal sight. My son, the man who had looked down on me with such curated vitriol only an hour ago, was now slumped, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing the floor like a petulant child's. He didn't look at me as he passed. He didn't look at Elena. He just stared at the ground, his world having shrunk from $100 million empire to the 4 inches of space directly in front of his feet. Sarah followed close behind the officers, her heels clicking with a sharp, aggressive rhythm. She stopped just as she reached the threshold of the door, turning back to look at me. The grief and shock that had been on her face minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating mask that made my skin crawl. "You think you've won, David?" she asked, her voice low and venomous. "You think you can just walk out of here with that key and start a new life with a daughter you don't even know? You're an old man in a borrowed suit. You're a footnote. And footnotes get erased." She didn't wait for a response. She spun around and vanished into the elevator lobby, leaving a scent of expensive perfume and unspoken threats hanging in the stagnant office air. "Don't listen to her, Dad," Elena said, her hand still steady on my arm. She looked at Attorney Stone. "Arthur, we need to get him out of here. If Sarah's making threats, she's already making calls." Stone nodded, his face grim as he gathered the remaining documents. "The parking garage is compromised. There are reporters down there who I suspect are actually on Sarah's payroll. We'll take the service elevator to the loading dock. I have a car waiting 2 blocks away." I felt like I was moving through waist-deep water. Everything was happening too fast. My brain was still trying to wrap itself around the fact that I had a daughter, a living, breathing piece of Emily in me that had been kept in a box for 25 years. I looked at the crimson key in my hand. It felt cold, heavy, and far more dangerous than any weapon. I didn't know it yet, I thought as we stepped into the dim, industrial light of the service elevator, but the betrayal wasn't finished. The people Daniel had surrounded himself with were just the sharks in the water. The real predator was someone I'd invited to my own kitchen table. The ride down was silent, the hum of the elevator cables the only sound in the cramped space. I looked at Elena and the flickering overhead light. She looked so much like Emily it hurt to breathe. The way she tilted her head, the way she pursed her lips when she was thinking it was like a cruel trick of the light. "Elena," I whispered, "why now? Why did Emily wait until she was gone to bring you back?" Elena sighed, leaning against the metal wall of the elevator, because as long as she was alive, Herbert's people had leverage over her. He had associates, Dad, dangerous men who didn't want the Blackwood Ledger to ever see the light of day. They used me as a threat. If Emily didn't stay quiet, if she didn't play the part of the loyal, grieving widow, they told her they'd find me. She spent 25 years paying them off with the Lara fortune just to keep me hidden in Europe. The elevator doors opened with a heavy thud onto the loading dock. The air smelled of diesel fumes and wet concrete. A black SUV was idling near the heavy steel doors. "Get in," Stone commanded. "The driver is one of mine. He'll take you to a safe house in the hills. I'll meet you there after I've finished filing the injunctions to freeze the rest of the accounts." As we stepped out into the humid afternoon air, a man stepped out from behind a stack of wooden pallets. He wasn't one of Stone's men. He was tall, wearing a nondescript gray windbreaker and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't have a gun, but he had an aura of practiced violence that made me instinctively pull Elena behind me. "Mr. Valverde," the man said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Mrs. Sarah says you have something that doesn't belong to you. She'd like it back. Now." "Move aside," Stone snapped, stepping forward with his briefcase, raised like a shield. "The police are still in the building. You don't want to do this here." The man smiled a thin, joyless expression. "The police are busy processing a high-profile arrest. They aren't looking at the loading dock. Give me the key, David. Don't make this harder for the girl than it has to be." I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, but a raw, protective rage. I had spent my life being small, being the man who took the hits and kept working. I had let Daniel humiliate me. I had let the world forget I existed. But I wasn't going to let this shadow touch my daughter. "You want it?" I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I held up the crimson key. "Come and take it from an old man. Let's see how much you're willing to bleed for Sarah's paycheck." The man shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. He looked like he was about to lung, but then the sound of a siren wailed from the street, getting closer. He hesitated, looking toward the exit. "This isn't over," he muttered, stepping back into the shadows of the pallets. You can't stay in that car forever." We scrambled into the SUV, the doors locking with a heavy, mechanical thud. As the driver tore away from the curb, I looked back through the tinted window. The man in the gray windbreaker was on his phone, his eyes locked on our license plate. "Who was that?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "A cleaner," Stone said from the front seat. "Sarah's family has roots in the kind of businesses that don't show up on a tax return. She didn't just marry Daniel for his money. She married him because she needed a legitimate front for her father's operations. The Blackwood Ledger. It doesn't just have names of businessmen. It has the entire map of their smuggling routes." I sat back, the crimson key pressed against my palm. The weight of it was starting to make sense. Emily hadn't just left me an inheritance, she'd left me a war. The drive to the safe house took nearly an hour. We climbed into the hills, the city lights fading into a dull orange glow in the rearview mirror. The house was a modest bungalow tucked behind a thick screen of pine trees. It looked like the kind of place a retired schoolteacher might live, not a fortress for a man holding a multi-million-dollar secret. "Stay here," Stone said as we climbed out. "The windows are reinforced and the alarm is silent. I'll be back in the morning with the next steps." Inside, the house was quiet and smelled of lemon polish. Elena went to the kitchen to make some tea, her movements practiced and calm despite the chaos of the day. I sat on the floral sofa, still wearing that oversized, mothball-scented suit. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in liver spots and calluses, the hands of a man who had built things with wood and steel. Now, they were holding the fate of a city. There was a knock at the door. I froze. Elena came out of the kitchen, a mug in her hand, her eyes wide. "Is that Arthur?" "He said he wouldn't be back until morning," I whispered. I walked to the door, peering through the peephole. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the man in the gray windbreaker. It was Robert, my sister Linda's husband, the man who had lent me the suit. "Robert?" I said, opening the door a crack. "What are you doing here? How did you find us?" Robert looked frantic. His face was flushed, and his tie was pulled loose. "David, thank God. Linda, she's been worried sick. I went to the office and saw the police. They told me you'd been taken to a safe location. I had to make sure you were okay." I opened the door wider, letting him in. "I'm fine, Robert. This is Elena, my daughter." Robert stopped dead, looking at Elena. "A daughter? David, what the hell is going on?" "Linda's at home crying her eyes out. She thinks Daniel's gone crazy." "He has." "Robert," I said, sitting back down. "It's a long story, but I'm safe for now." Robert sat in the armchair across from me, his eyes darting around the room. He seemed nervous, his foot tapping rhythmically on the rug. "And the inheritance? I heard rumors. People are saying Emily left you everything. Millions, David. Real money." "It's complicated," I said, a small alarm bell going off in the back of my mind. Robert had always been a bit of a gambler, nothing like Daniel, but he'd had his share of bad luck at the tracks. "Why are you really here, Robert?" He hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "David, listen to me. There are people looking for you, people you don't want to mess with. They came to the house. They threatened Linda. They said, if I didn't find you and tell them where that key is, they'd hurt her." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Threatened Linda? Who?" "The people Sarah works for," Robert said, his voice cracking. "They know about the ledger, David. They know what's in it. They said they'd give me $1 million just to tell them which house Stone took you to. Just to take the key while you were sleeping." I looked at my brother-in-law, the man I'd shared Thanksgiving dinners with for 30 years. I looked at the suit I was wearing, his suit. "Did you take the money, Robert?" I asked, my voice as cold as the loading dock. Robert didn't look at me. He looked at his shoes. "I didn't have a choice, David. We're broke, the shop is failing, and the mortgage is 3 months behind. Linda doesn't know, but I've lost everything," I thought. "I thought if I just got them the key, nobody would get hurt. You've got millions now. You don't need that ledger." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "You sold us out, to the people who tried to kill me." "I didn't sell you out," Robert yelled, standing up with me. "I'm trying to save Linda. They're right outside, David. They followed me. Just give them the key and this all ends. Please." Before I could respond, the front window shattered. A heavy black canister thudded onto the carpet, hissing as it began to spew thick, white smoke. "Elena, get down!" I screamed. Through the haze, I saw the front door kick open. The man in the gray windbreaker stepped through the smoke, a gas mask covering his face. Behind him, Sarah stood on the porch, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She wasn't wearing her sunglasses anymore. Her eyes were cold, bright, and full of a hunger that had nothing to do with money. "I told you, David," she shouted over the sound of the hissing gas. "Footnotes get erased." I grabbed Elena's hand, dragging her toward the back hallway, but Robert grabbed my arm. "The key, David. Just give it to them." I looked at Robert, and in that moment, I realized that the Mottrum bill Daniel had thrown on the table wasn't the greatest insult I'd faced today. The greatest insult was the man holding my arm, willing to trade my life for a way out of his own mistakes. I didn't know it yet. I thought as I swung my fist into Robert's jaw. But the Blackwood ledger wasn't just a list of names, it was a mirror, and it was showing everyone's true face. We scrambled toward the back door, the smoke filling my lungs, the world turning into a blur of gray and white. I could hear Sarah's laughter, following us into the dark. The night air hit my lungs like a bucket of ice water, a sharp, freezing contrast to the acrid, chemical heat of the smoke filling the house. I stumbled off the back porch, my knees buckling as my oversized shoes caught on the uneven dirt. Elena caught me, her grip like iron, pulling me into the dense wall of pine trees that bordered the property. Behind us, the house was a glowing box of chaos, the white smoke billowing out of the shattered windows like a ghost trying to escape. "Over here, Dad, stay low," Elena hissed. I could hear them behind us. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the man in the gray windbreaker, the cleaner, and the sharp, erratic crunch of Sarah's designer heels on the gravel. But it was the other sound that broke my heart, the sound of Robert coughing, his voice wavering as he shouted into the dark. "David, don't be a fool. They'll find you anyway. Just give them what they want and we can all go home." I didn't look back. If I looked back, I'd see the face of the man who had sat at my table every Christmas for 3 decades, and I didn't think my heart could take another betrayal tonight. I felt the old, familiar flutter in my chest, the skipped beats, the tightness that felt like a fist squeezing my ribs. I pressed my hand against the crimson key in my pocket, the cold metal biting into my palm. It was the only thing I had left of Emily, and I'd be damned if I let Sarah's blood-money-hungry hands touch it. We scrambled deeper into the woods. The branches whipped against my face, stinging my skin, but I didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug for a 74-year-old man. It makes you feel like you're 20 again, right until the moment it drops you off a cliff. I didn't know it yet. I thought, my breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps, but we weren't just running from Sarah, we were running toward a truth that would make the Blackwood ledger look like a bedtime story. "In here," Elena whispered, shoving aside a heavy curtain of hemlock branches. Behind the trees was a small, rusted corrugated metal shed, likely used for garden tools or old tractor parts. It smelled of oil and decay, but it was dark. We slumped against the interior wall, the cold metal chilling my back. I could feel Elena's heart racing through her shoulder as she leaned against me. "Are you okay?" she breathed, her eyes searching mine in the shadows. "I've been better," I whispered back, wiping a smear of soot from my forehead. "Elena, your mother, she really kept you in a convent? All those years?" Elena looked away, her jaw tight. "She thought she was saving me, Dad, and maybe she was, but it was a lonely way to grow up. Looking at pictures of a brother who didn't exist, and a father who was supposedly a memory. I used to imagine you were a king or an explorer, something grand." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "Finding out you were just a man who worked too hard and got cheated by life, it was actually better. It made you real." I reached out and took her hand. It was the first time I truly held my daughter's hand, and the weight of the lost years hit me all at once. "I would have come for you. If I'd known, I would have torn the world apart to find you." "I know," she said softly. "That's why she didn't tell you. She knew you'd die trying." Outside, the woods went silent. No more shouting, no more crunching leaves. The silence was worse. It meant they were hunting. It meant the cleaner had taken over, and he wasn't going to make noise. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the cracks in the metal wall, sweeping across the rusted tools like a searchlight. I held my breath, the air trapped in my lungs like a stone. The light lingered on the door handle. Click, the sound of a safety being switched off. "I know you're in there, David," the cleaner's voice said, muffled by the metal. It was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of mercy. "The girl doesn't have to be part of the collateral. Just slide the key under the door. Mrs. Sarah is willing to increase the severance for your cooperation. 5 million, cash. You can take your daughter and disappear to whatever island you want. I looked at Elena. $5 million. It was more money than I'd seen in my entire life combined. I could buy her the world. I could fix everything. But Elena shook her head, her eyes fierce. She pointed to the key in my pocket, then to the floor. She wasn't going to let me trade the truth for a comfortable lie. You're talking to the wrong man, I shouted, my voice echoing in the small shed. I spent my life building things that last. You and Sarah. You just build graves. I'm not giving you anything. The flashlight beam vanished. For a second, I thought he was walking away. Then, the first bullet ripped through the metal door, showering us in sparks and shards of rust. Get down! I yelled, throwing my body over Elena's. Another shot, then another. The sound was deafening in the confined space, the thwip-thwip of suppressed rounds punching holes in the thin metal. One of them hit an old canister of gasoline in the corner, and the smell of fuel began to fill the air. We have to move, Elena screamed over the noise. She grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the wall and slammed it against the back panel of the shed. The rusted bolts groaned but held. She swung again, her face contorted with effort. On the third swing, the panel gave way with a screech of tortured metal. We tumbled out the back, rolling down a steep embankment just as the cleaner kicked in the front door. We didn't stop to look back. We slid and scrambled down the slope, the dirt filling my shoes, until we hit a narrow, paved road at the bottom of the hill. A pair of headlights crested the rise. Is that Arthur? Elena gasped, waving her arms. The car slowed down, a white sedan that looked nothing like Stone's SUV. As it pulled to a stop, the window rolled down. It wasn't Arthur Stone. It was Catherine, Daniel's mother-in-law. She looked pale, her hair perfect despite the hour, her gold cross glinting in the dashboard lights. Get in, she said, her voice trembling. Quickly, before they see the lights. We didn't have a choice. We scrambled into the back seat, the leather cold against my skin. Catherine didn't wait. She floored the accelerator, the tires screaming as she sped away from the safe house. Catherine, I asked, trying to steady my breathing. What are you doing here? I thought you were with Sarah. Sarah is a monster, Catherine whispered, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. I knew she was ambitious, David. I knew she was hard. But tonight, when she started talking about erasing you, I saw her father in her. I saw the rot. She glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I'm not doing this for you, David. I'm doing this because I won't let my daughter become a murderer. I won't have that on my soul. Where are you taking us? Elena asked. To the only place Sarah won't look, Catherine said. The old Stone estate. It's been tied up in probate for months. The power is off, the gates are locked, but I have the codes. The drive was a blur of dark trees and winding roads. My heart was starting to settle, but the pressure in my chest remained a constant, nagging reminder of the incident. I leaned my head against the window, watching the moonlight dance on the trees. I didn't know it yet, I thought, but Catherine wasn't our savior. She was just the first piece of a much larger betrayal, because Sarah wasn't just a girl with a plan. She was a girl with a partner, and that partner hadn't even shown his face yet. We pulled up to a massive wrought iron gate. Catherine punched in a code, and the gates groaned open. The Stone estate was a sprawling Gothic mansion that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. It was dark, silent, and overgrown with ivy that looked like grasping fingers. Go inside, Catherine said, handing me a heavy brass key. There's a panic room in the library. It has its own phone line. Call the police. Call whoever you need to. I'll go back and try to lead them away. Why are you helping us now, Catherine? Elena asked, her eyes narrowing. You've spent the last 5 years treating my father like dirt. Catherine looked at her, and for the first time, I saw genuine shame in her eyes. Because I was a coward, Elena. I liked the money. I liked the status. And I let my daughter convince me that your father was the villain so I wouldn't have to feel guilty about spending Emily's fortune. She looked at me. I'm sorry, David, truly. We climbed out of the car, and she sped away, her taillights disappearing into the gloom. We walked up the stone steps of the mansion, the air feeling colder with every step. I unlocked the heavy oak door, and we stepped into the foyer. It was cavernous, the furniture covered in white sheets like a room full of ghosts. Dad, give me the key, Elena said as we walked toward the library. I reached into my pocket. The crimson one. No, she said, her voice suddenly different. The key to the panic room. I'll get the lights. I handed her the brass key. As she took it, our fingers brushed, and I felt a strange tremor, not from her, but from the room itself. The lights didn't come on. Instead, a voice spoke from the darkness of the library, a voice that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the cleaner. It wasn't Sarah. You really shouldn't have trusted her, David, the voice said. A lamp flickered on, sitting on a desk in the center of the room. Sitting behind the desk, holding a glass of amber liquid, was Arthur Stone. But he wasn't wearing his suit. He was wearing a casual sweater, his legs crossed, a look of bored amusement on his face. And on the desk, right next to his glass, was a file labeled The Blackwood Ledger. Arthur? I stammered. What? What are you doing here? You said you were at the office. The office is for the help, David, Stone said, taking a sip of his drink. I've been waiting for you to bring me that crimson key. It's the last piece of the puzzle. You see, the ledger is encrypted. The names are all there, but the account numbers, those require a physical key to unlock. I stepped back, pulling Elena with me. You're in on this, with Sarah. Stone laughed a cold, dry sound. With Sarah? No. Sarah is a blunt instrument. She's useful for making messes, but she's far too emotional. No, David. I'm the one who hired the investigator for Emily. I'm the one who convinced her to write that will. My head was spinning. Why? Why do all this, if you were just going to steal it? Because, Stone said, standing up and walking toward us, I didn't just want the money. I wanted the power. The ledger contains the secrets of every major player in this state. With that key, I don't just become rich. I become the man who owns the men who own the world. He looked at Elena, his eyes glinting. And as for the daughter, well, she was a lovely touch, wasn't she? A perfect emotional hook to keep you moving exactly where I wanted you. I looked at Elena, my heart breaking. Elena, tell me he's lying. Elena didn't look at me. She stepped away from my side and walked toward Stone. She didn't look scared. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like she was coming home. I'm sorry, Dad, she said, her voice flat and cold. But $5 million was never going to be enough. Stone promised me half of everything, and he's the only one who can actually deliver. I stood there in the center of the dark mansion, a 74-year-old man in a borrowed suit, clutching a crimson key that was now my death warrant. I looked at the daughter I had just found, and the lawyer I had trusted, and I realized that the incident on the kitchen floor was the kindest thing anyone had done to me in years. What happened next? I thought as Stone reached for a gun in his desk drawer, changed everything, because they all forgot one thing about a man who has nothing left to lose. He's the most dangerous man in the room. The world didn't just tilt, it shattered. I stood there, my boots rooted to a Persian rug that probably cost more than my entire childhood home, watching the woman I thought was my flesh and blood walk toward the man who had orchestrated my destruction. Elena, or whoever she was, didn't even look back. The warmth I'd felt from her hand in the woods, the shared tears, the dad that had tasted like salvation. It was all a script, a perfectly executed performance designed to crack open the chest of a lonely, dying old man. Arthur Stone took a slow, methodical sip of his drink, the ice clinking against the glass like a funeral bell. Don't look so surprised, David. You were a foreman. You know that if a structure is built on a rotten foundation, it only takes one well-placed shove to bring it down. You were the foundation. Your grief was the rot. And Maya here, he gestured to the woman I'd known as Elena. She was the shove. Maya, I whispered. The name felt like sand in my mouth. Maya Vance, she said, her voice devoid of the soft, melodic lilt she'd used in the car. It was clipped, professional, and cold enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I'm an associate at Stone's firm, David, specialized in emotional asset recovery. The DNA tests, forged. The stories about the convent, a blend of Emily's old diaries and a little creative writing. You wanted a daughter so badly you didn't even ask for a second opinion. I felt the familiar, crushing weight in my chest. The incident was returning, but this time, it wasn't just my heart failing, it was my soul. I looked at the crimson key in my hand. They wanted it. They had burned a house down, betrayed a family, and turned my own life into a horror movie for a piece of metal. I didn't know it yet. I thought, the library spinning around me. But the most dangerous thing in this room wasn't the gun in Stone's hand. It was the fact that I finally stopped being afraid of dying. Stone set his glass down and held out his hand. "The key, David. Give it to me, and I'll let you walk out of here. I'll even give you enough money to live out your remaining 6 months, in a place where the nurses are pretty and the morphine is top shelf. You've lost. Accept it with what little dignity you have left." I looked at him, then at Maya. She was leaning against the desk, checking her fingernails. I was a project she had finished, a task she had checked off her list. The memory of our hug in the woods flashed through my mind, and a sudden, sharp clarity cut through the pain in my chest. "You know, Arthur," I said, my voice raspier than usual but steady. "I spent 40 years on job sites. I've seen men like you. Men who think they can read a blueprint and understand the building. But you never spent a day in the mud. You don't know how things actually hold together." Stone's eyes narrowed. "Is there a point to this geriatric wisdom, or are you just stalling for a heart attack?" "The point," I said, taking a step toward the desk, "is that Emily knew you. She knew you better than she knew me at the end. She knew you'd come for the ledger. She knew you'd try to find a way to use her secrets to build your own kingdom." I held up the crimson key. The moonlight from the library window caught the metal, making it glow like a drop of blood. "You think this unlocks the safe at the Blackwood cabin? You think the account numbers are waiting for you under the floorboards?" Maya straightened up, her eyes flicking to the key. "That's what the will said. That's what the private investigator's notes confirmed." I let out a dry, hacking laugh. The will that Arthur helped her write. The notes that Arthur had access to. Emily was a lot of things, but she wasn't stupid. She knew if she put the real location in the will, you'd find it before the ink was dry. Stone stepped around the desk, the gun now leveled directly at my forehead. "Where is it, David? If the cabin is a decoy, where did she put the ledger?" I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. For the first time in 20 years, I felt like I was in control of the job site. "You've been looking for a book, Arthur. A ledger. You think it's hidden in wood and steel. But Emily didn't trust safes. She didn't trust buildings." I reached into the oversized pocket of Robert's suit and pulled out the small, blackened shard of wood, the one from the cabin fire 25 years ago. I laid it on the desk next to Stone's drink. "She gave me this at the meeting," I said, "and you let me keep it because you thought it was just a piece of trash, a sentimental relic." Stone looked at the charred wood, his brow furrowed. "It is a piece of trash." "Look closer," I whispered. Stone leaned in, his greed overriding his caution. As he did, I didn't reach for the gun. I reached for the heavy brass lamp on the desk. With a roar that shouldn't have been possible for a man of my age, I swung. The base of the lamp caught Stone square in the temple with a sickening thud. He went down like a sack of stones, his glass shattering on the floor. Maya lunged for me, her professional mask finally slipping into a snarl of rage. She was fast, but she was expecting a broken old man. She wasn't expecting a foreman who had spent his life swinging a sledgehammer. I stepped into her path, using my weight to shoulder-check her back toward the library shelves. She hit the wood hard, the breath leaving her lungs in a sharp wheeze. I didn't wait. I grabbed the Blackwood ledger file from the desk and the gunstone had dropped. My heart was screaming, a rhythmic drumming that felt like it was trying to burst through my ribs, but I forced my legs to move. I didn't know it yet, I thought as I stumbled out of the library and into the dark hallway. But the house wasn't empty, and Arthur Stone wasn't the only one who had been lied to. I ran or as close to running as a man with a failing heart can manage toward the foyer. I could hear Maya screaming for the guards behind me. The silence of the mansion was gone, replaced by the frantic sounds of a hunt. I reached the heavy oak front door and threw it open, expecting to see the black SUV or the cleaner waiting for me. Instead, the driveway was filled with police cars. Blue and red lights strobed against the Gothic stone walls of the mansion. And standing at the bottom of the steps, flanked by 2 officers, was Henry, my neighbor, my friend, the man who had found me on the kitchen floor. "Henry," I gasped, leaning against the doorframe for support. "Took you long enough, David," Henry shouted, gesturing to the officers. "I told them you were a stubborn old goat, but I didn't think you'd take on the whole firm by yourself." I stumbled down the steps, the file clutched to my chest. "How did you find me? How did you know?" "I didn't," Henry said, catching me as my legs finally gave out. "But Emily did. She came to see me 3 months ago, David. Before she died, she knew Stone was circling. She knew Daniel was lost. She told me if you ever went missing after the will was read, I was to call a specific number." He looked at the mansion. "A federal number." A man in a dark suit stepped forward from the shadows of a patrol car. He didn't look like a local cop. He looked like the kind of man who didn't exist on paper. "Mr. Valverde? I'm Special Agent Miller with the DOJ. We've been tracking Arthur Stone's consulting firm for 3 years. We just needed a witness with enough leverage to bring him into the light." I looked at the file in my hand. This is it, the ledger, but Stone said it was encrypted. Agent Miller took the file, his expression grim. "He's right, it is. But we don't need the account numbers to start the arrests. We just need the names of the people who paid for the encryption." He looked at me with something like admiration. "You did well, David. Most men would have taken the 5 million and ran." "I'm not most men," I whispered. "I'm a Valverde." As the EMTs loaded me onto a stretcher, I saw Maya and a bloodied Arthur Stone being led out of the mansion in handcuffs. Stone looked at me, his face a mask of pure, impotent hatred. Maya just looked stunned, the specialist, who had been outplayed by her own target. But as the ambulance doors began to close, I saw one more car pull into the driveway, a simple, silver sedan. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She wasn't an actress. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She was wearing a nurse's uniform, her face tired, her eyes full of a haunting, familiar light. She walked toward the ambulance, the police trying to stop her, but Agent Miller waved them off. She reached the doors just as they were about to click shut. She looked at me, and I felt the air leave my lungs for a completely different reason. "Dad," she said. Her voice was different. It wasn't the practiced melody of Maya. It was raw. It was shaky. It sounded like the girl who used to cry in the garage when she scraped her knee. "I'm Elena," she said, tears streaming down her face. "The real one. Mom, she told me you'd be here. She told me to wait until the lights were on." I reached out a trembling hand, and this time, when she took it, the world didn't shatter. It finally, after 25 years of darkness, began to heal. I didn't know it yet. I thought as the ambulance began to pull away. But the revenge wasn't the money. It wasn't the arrests. It was the fact that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the man sitting at the end of the table. I was the man at the head of a family. But as I looked at the real Elena, I saw a flicker of something in her pocket, a small, crimson key, exactly like the one I had given Stone. My heart skipped a beat. If she was the real Elena, why did she have the key? And, if she had the key, what was in the safe I'd just sent the FBI to find? What happened next, I realized, was the final twist Emily had planned. A twist that wouldn't just destroy my enemies, but would force me to decide exactly what kind of man I really was. The siren was a scream that wouldn't stop, a high-pitched, oscillating wail that seemed to vibrate inside my very teeth. I lay on the gurney, the oxygen mask a cold, plastic seal over my face, the world outside the ambulance windows, a blurred kaleidoscope of blue and red. The EMT was leaning over me, his movements a frantic blur of blue latex and professional urgency. He was shouting things, blood pressure readings, heart rate intervals, but his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at the woman sitting on the narrow bench opposite the gurney. The real Elena. At least that's what she had claimed. She was holding my hand, her fingers interlaced with mine. Her grip was fundamentally different from Maya's. Maya's touch had been a simulation, a calculated weight designed to mimic affection. This woman's hand was trembling, the skin slightly damp with sweat, her pulse fluttering against my palm like a trapped bird. She didn't smell like the expensive, floral perfume Sarah favored, or the clinical, sharp scent Maya had carried. She smelled like antiseptic, coffee, and old books. "I saw it," I whispered, the words rattling in my chest like dry leaves. I used my free hand to point a shaky finger toward the pocket of her nurse's cardigan. "The key, the crimson key. Why do you have a second one?" She looked down at her pocket, then back at me. She didn't look panicked. She didn't look like a thief caught in the act. She looked weary, a deep, bone-settling exhaustion in her eyes that mirrored my own. "Mom gave it to me, Dad," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "She told me the one in the will was a lightning rod. She called it the martyr's key. She knew that as soon as that will was read, every rat in the city would come out of the walls to bite the hand holding it. She needed you to have a decoy, something to keep them busy while the real work was done." I closed my eyes, the fluorescent lights of the ambulance searing my retinas. Emily. Even at the end, even when her body was failing, and her mind was clouded by the fog of chemotherapy. She had turned our lives into a grand masterclass of misdirection. She had turned me into a target so that our daughter could be the silent blade. "How do I know?" I croaked, the doubt tasting like copper in my mouth. To be fooled once was a tragedy. To be fooled twice in the same night would be the final, humiliating punchline to my life. "How do I know you're mine?" They had DNA papers, Elena. They had memories. They had everything. Elena didn't reach for a folder. She didn't call a lawyer. She reached into her small canvas bag and pulled out a tattered, wooden object. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of scrap pine, its left wing slightly shorter than the right. It was smoothed by time and the oils of 1,000 touches. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. I had carved that bird in my garage 30 years ago. I had meant it for Daniel's 5th birthday, but he had looked at it with a confused frown and asked where the batteries went. I thought I had thrown it in the scrap bin. I thought it had been burned in the fireplace of our old house. "Mom rescued it," Elena said, her voice cracking. "She kept it in her velvet jewelry box, right next to her engagement ring. She told me it was the first thing you ever built for the family. She said you called it the steady flyer. She told me that if the day ever came where I found you, and the world had made you too hard to believe in the truth, I should show you the bird with the uneven wing, because only you knew why you carved it that way. Because the wind isn't always fair," I whispered, the memory flooding back with a violence that made my heart monitor chirp a warning. "You have to be built for the lean, not the straight." I started to cry then, not the quiet, dignified tears of an old man, but deep, racking sobs that made my chest heave. It was her, my little girl. The daughter I had mourned for 25 years was sitting in an ambulance with me, holding a piece of my own soul in her hands. I didn't know it yet. I thought as the ambulance screeched to a halt at the emergency bay. But the reunion was the easy part. Because the key in Elena's pocket wasn't just for a safe at a cabin. It was the final piece of a trap Emily had set for the man who had really destroyed our family. A man whose name hadn't even been mentioned in the will. The hospital was a blur of white corridors and sharp, stinging needles. They pumped me full of anticoagulants and sedatives, trying to quiet the storm in my chest. I fell into a dark, fitful sleep, dreaming of fire and mahogany tables. When I finally opened my eyes, the sun was streaming through a thin gap in the hospital curtains. Henry was sitting in a chair by the window, peeling an orange with a pocket knife. He looked up, his face creasing into a weary grin. "About time, you old goat. I was starting to think you were just holding your breath to get out of paying for the taxi." "Where is she, Henry?" I asked, my voice feeling like I'd swallowed glass. "Elena, she's with the feds," Henry said, popping a slice of orange into his mouth. "Agent Miller. They're in a private room downstairs. Turns out, your daughter has a lot more to say than just, hello. She's been working undercover at the Stone firm for 2 years, David. Not as a lawyer, as a janitor. She's the one who's been feeding Emily the information about Arthur's special clients." I sat up, the ivy lines tugging at my arm. "The Varellas, Sarah's family." Henry's smile vanished. "Worse, Sarah was just the bait. Her father, Victor Varela, is the one who's been using the Stone firm to move offshore assets. He's the one who wanted that ledger, and he's the one who's currently wondering why his daughter is in a holding cell and his cleaner is in the morgue. I have to get out of here," I said, struggling to swing my legs over the side of the bed. "Sit down, David," Henry commanded, his voice surprisingly firm. "You're in no condition to go hunting sharks. Besides, Miller has the ledger you grabbed from Stone's office. He thinks he has everything he needs." "He doesn't," I said, my heart starting to pound again. "The ledger I took, the one on Stone's desk, it was a dummy. Stone told me himself the accounts were encrypted. He thought the crimson key I had would unlock it. But if Elena has the real key, that means the ledger the FBI has is a paperweight," a voice said from the doorway. Agent Miller stepped into the room. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. Beside him stood Elena, her nurse's uniform replaced by a simple pair of jeans and a sweater. She looked sharp, focused, and terrifyingly like her mother. "Mr. Valverde," Miller said, pulling a chair to the bedside. "Your daughter just gave us a very interesting piece of hardware. But we have a problem. Victor Varela's lawyers are already moving. They're filing for a suppression of the evidence you took from the mansion. They're claiming it was an illegal search and seizure, that Stone was acting under duress. If we don't get the real data within the next 12 hours, a judge is going to throw the whole thing out, and Varela walks. Where is the real ledger, Elena? I asked. She looked at Miller, then at me. It's not at the cabin, Dad, and it's not in a safe. Mom knew the Varelas would monitor any property she owned, so she put it somewhere they'd never think to look, somewhere that represented the only time she felt truly safe. I searched my memory, through the decades of bitterness and silence. The diner? The one where we had our first date? Elena shook her head. No, the construction site. The one you were foreman on when the fire happened. The Legacy Project downtown. I felt a chill. The Legacy Project had been a massive skyscraper, the jewel of the city's skyline. It had been completed 20 years ago. That's 1 million square feet of steel and concrete, Elena. You might as well say it's at the bottom of the ocean. Section Bon, pillar muy high, she said, inside the cornerstone. Mom donated $1 million to the building fund to have that pillar dedicated to the men who built the future. She told the architects she wanted a time capsule placed inside. They thought it was a sentimental gesture from a rich widow. But the key, I said, clutching the crimson metal in my pocket. What does it unlock? It's not a key for a lock, Elena said, taking it from my hand. She pressed a small, hidden stud on the side of the ornate handle. The top of the key popped open like a locket, revealing a tiny, high-density flash drive. It's the decryption software. Without this, the time capsule is just a box of old photos. With it, it's a death warrant for the Varela Empire. I'll send a team, Miller said, reaching for the key. No, I said, my hand closing over Elena's. If you send a team of feds to a public building with jackhammers, Varela will know within minutes. He has people in the building department, in the police, everywhere. You'll never get it out of the lobby. Then what do you suggest? Miller asked, his eyes narrowing. I suggest we do it the way a foreman does it, I said, a slow, cold fire burning in my belly. We go in as a maintenance crew, after hours. I know the blueprints of that building better than the people who live in it. I know how to get into the pillar without tripping a single alarm. Dad, you can't, Elena protested. Your heart. My heart has been waiting 25 years for this. Elena, I said, looking her in the eyes. I'm not dying in a hospital bed while that man walks free. I'm going to finish the job your mother started. I'm going to clear the Valverde name. I didn't know it yet, I thought, as Miller reluctantly nodded. But the real Elena hadn't told me everything. There was one more secret Emily had kept, one that had nothing to do with money or ledgers. A secret that was hidden in the very pillar we were about to break open. We left the hospital at midnight. Miller provided the cover a nondescript white van and 3 workmen who were actually tactical agents. I was dressed in my old work clothes, the heavy denim and flannel feeling like armor. Henry sat in the back with us, clutching a heavy wrench. I'm too old for this, he muttered, though he was grinning like a teenager. The Legacy building loomed over us, a spire of glass and light. We entered through the loading dock, the same way I'd entered buildings for 40 years. My legs were heavy, and every breath felt like a struggle, but the adrenaline was back, sharp and biting. We reached pillar muy high in the main atrium. It was a massive column of polished granite. I ran my hand over the stone, feeling the cold, smooth surface. Right here, I whispered. As the agent set up a portable sonic drill to whisper through the granite, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a restricted number. I answered it, expecting Miller's office. Hello, David, the voice said. It was smooth, cultured, and carried the weight of 1,000 threats. I believe you have something of mine, and I believe I have something of yours. I froze. Varela? I don't care about the daughter, David, Victor Varela said. She's a nuisance. But Daniel is a business associate. And currently, Daniel is being transferred between facilities. It would be a tragedy if his transport van didn't make it to the destination. I looked at the drill as it bit into the stone. You're threatening your own son-in-law? He's a failure, David. But he's a Valverde failure. And I know you, despite everything, still love him. Give me the key. Leave the pillar. And your son lives to see the sun rise. Refuse. And he'll be the last thing you ever lose. I looked at Elena, who was watching the drill with an intensity that bordered on hunger. I looked at the crimson key in her hand. My son's life against the destruction of the man who had ruined us all. What happened next? I thought. The granite dust falling like snow around my boots, was the moment I finally understood why Emily had left the final choice to me. Because she knew that to save the family, I might have to destroy the only thing I had left of it. The silence of the legacy building's atrium was broken only by the low, mechanical whine of the sonic drill and the sound of my own shallow, panicked breathing. Victor Varella's voice was still echoing in my ear, cold and metallic, like a blade being sharpened. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a ghost that had haunted the periphery of my son's life, a man who traded in human weakness. And right now, he was holding the only thing I had left of my past, my broken, treacherous, yet still beloved son. "David?" Elena's voice was sharp, pulling me back from the edge of the abyss. She saw the phone in my hand, saw the way my knuckles had turned white. "What is it? What did he say?" I looked at the pillar. The drill had finally pierced the granite, and a small, hollow cavity was visible behind the stone. Inside sat a burnished titanium cylinder, no bigger than a thermos. It was the legacy. The secret that had cost Emily her peace and was now threatening to cost me my son. "He has Daniel," I whispered. I looked at Agent Miller, who was already signaling his team to trace the call. "He says, if we don't leave the building and hand over the key, the transport van won't make it to the precinct. He'll kill him, Miller. He'll kill his own daughter's husband just to keep those accounts hidden." Miller swore under his breath, his eyes darting to the atrium entrance. "We can't stop, David. If we let Varela get this drive, we lose the only chance to dismantle his network. We're talking about human trafficking, money laundering, and a dozen murders, including, potentially, Herbert Lara's." I felt the weight of the Motram by Muitam million, the weight of the mothball-scented suit, and the weight of every lonely night I had spent in that two-room apartment. It all felt like lead. I didn't know it yet, I thought, looking at the titanium cylinder, but Emily had already made this choice for me. She had known that when it came down to it, I would always be the man who reached for his son, even if that son was holding a knife. "Open the capsule," I commanded. My voice was no longer that of a dying man. It was the voice of a foreman who had seen a crane collapse and knew exactly which cable to cut. Elena reached into the cavity and pulled out the cylinder. She unscrewed the top, and instead of just one flash drive, 3 items fell out onto the velvet-lined tray. There was the high-density drive, yes, but there was also a small, digital voice recorder and a single, folded piece of paper. "Play it," I said, pointing to the recorder. Elena hit the button. Emily's voice filled the empty atrium, clear and resonant, stripped of the hospital's raspy fatigue. This was Emily from a year ago, calculating, fierce, and heartbreakingly maternal. "Victor," the recording began, "if you are listening to this, it means you've finally backed David into a corner. You think you're holding Daniel as leverage. You think my husband's life is the price of your freedom." There was a pause, a chillingly calm silence on the tape. "But you forgot one thing, Victor. I knew Daniel was working for you. I knew he was feeding you my passwords. I knew he was the one who told you where the Blackwood ledger was stored. And because I knew, I made sure Daniel became your greatest liability." I looked at Elena, my mouth hanging open. Daniel. He wasn't just a victim of Sarah's manipulation. He had been an active participant in the Varela machine. "The drive in this capsule isn't just the ledger, Victor," Emily's voice continued, dripping with a cold, refined venom. "It's a record of every wire transfer Daniel made on your behalf. It's a record of the day he helped your cleaner bypass the security at the Lara estate. If Daniel dies, the encryption on this drive automatically breaks and broadcasts every file to the International Criminal Court. You can't kill the leverage, Victor, because the leverage is the only thing keeping you out of a black site prison." The recording clicked off. The atrium went deathly silent. My phone buzzed again. "Varela." I answered it, but I didn't say a word. I just held the phone up to the speaker of the recorder and hit replay. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, a glass shattering, a string of muffled curses in Italian. "You're bluffing," Varela hissed. "Emily was a romantic. She wouldn't set her own son up for a life sentence." "She didn't, Victor," I said, my voice cold as the granite pillar. "She set him up for a choice, just like she's setting you up for one. You let the van reach the precinct. You let Daniel face a judge for fraud, not a grave for your secrets. And in exchange, I give Miller the drive, and you get a 10-minute head start to find a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States." I looked at Miller. He looked like he wanted to arrest me on the spot, But he saw the look in my eyes. He saw the foreman who was ready to pull the whole building down on all of us. He gave a microscopic nod. 10 minutes, David. Varela growled. But tell your son, tell him his wife was the one who suggested the van accident. Even among thieves, there's no loyalty. The line went dead. Miller, get your team to that transport van, I said, slumped against the pillar. He's backing off. But he's going to burn every bridge on his way out. The aftermath didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a series of quiet, clinical clicks. The clicking of handcuffs on Victor Varela at a private airfield in New Jersey 6 hours later. Turns out, Miller didn't believe in 10-minute head starts. The clicking of a computer as the Blackwood ledger was finally decrypted, revealing a rot that reached into the very heart of the state capitol. And the clicking of a cell door. 2 weeks later, I stood in the visiting room of the county jail. I was wearing a new suit, charcoal gray, tailored, and smelling of nothing but fresh wool. The Mochumbai Muitam million was legally mine now, managed by a trust that Elena, the real Elena, and I had set up together. We were still strangers, she and I, but we were learning the language of each other through shared meals and long walks through the park where I used to take Daniel. Daniel sat across from me, separated by a thick pane of glass. He looked small. Without the designer suits, without the expensive watches and the borrowed arrogance of the Varelas, he looked like the boy who had once cried because he couldn't get his bike chain back on. She knew, Dad, he whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at the floor. Mom knew I was stealing from her. She knew I was helping Sarah. She knew, I said softly, but she also knew that the only way to save you from them was to make you useless to them. She didn't put you here to punish you, Daniel. She put you here because it's the only place Victor Varela couldn't reach you. Daniel looked up, his eyes red and raw. She saved my life by ruining it. No, I said, leaning toward the glass. She ruined the lie so you could start the truth. You're going to serve time, son. Fraud, conspiracy. It won't be easy. But when you get out, you won't be a Valverde failure. You'll just be a man. And I'll be waiting at the gate. Daniel started to cry the same messy, snot-filled sob I remembered from 25 years ago. He pressed his hand against the glass, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the weight of his contempt. I felt the weight of his need. I pressed my hand against his, the glass cold between us, but the connection finally real. I didn't know it yet. I thought as I walked out of the jail and into the bright afternoon sun. But the Mochum bill Daniel had thrown at me was the best thing he'd ever done. Because it reminded me that you can't buy dignity, and you certainly can't inherit a soul. Elena was waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against a modest sedan. She didn't want the Ferraris or the penthouses. She wanted the foundation we were building, the one for the men and women who had been erased by the legacy of people like the Stones and the Varelas. How is he? She asked, falling into step beside me. He's starting, I said. It's a long job, Elena. The foundation is cracked, and the wiring is a mess. But the structure is still sound. She smiled, and for a moment, the ghost of Emily was there in the tilt of her head. You sound like a foreman again, Dad. I never stopped being one, I said, patting the pocket of my suit. Inside, I wasn't carrying a crimson key or $1 million check. I was carrying the small, wooden bird with the uneven wing. The bird that was built for the lean, not the straight. As we drove away from the jail, I looked at the city skyline, at the legacy building, rising like a needle in the distance. I realized that my story wasn't about the calm, Mochumbai Muitam million. It wasn't about the revenge on Sarah or the fall of Arthur Stone. It was about the moment on the kitchen floor. It was about the fact that I had survived the heart attack not just to see my enemies fall, but to see my daughter rise. The Mochum bill was still in my old suit, tucked away in Robert's attic. I had told him to keep it. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest amount of money is the most expensive lesson you'll ever learn. Tell me, I said to Elena, as we merged into the evening traffic. Tell me more about the convent. Tell me about the letters I wrote that you never got to read. We have time, Dad, she said, her hand resting on mine. We have all the time in the world. And as the sun set over the city I had helped build, I finally understood what Emily had known all along. A legacy isn't something you leave behind in a will. It's the person sitting next to you, holding your hand and helping you find the way home.